Well, they've explained it to me. I had a phone call with them a couple months ago, and they said, we're having trouble with the Vatican. The Vatican Bank is a very delicate matter with the Vatican. We understand your position, but we have to, until this is resolved, we have to take the somewhat strange position that the Vatican Bank is not in the Vatican, and therefore not under the jurisdiction of our treaties.
And you responded? How did you respond to that?
Bullshit. That's how I responded to it.
Hi, I'm Alison Hope Weiner, and welcome to another episode of Media Mayhem. In the interest of continuing our in-depth look with experts at the Catholic Church and their legal problems and the ability to hold them responsible legally for not just sexual abuse, but there have been other lawsuits brought against the Catholic Church long before the scandal over priests sexually abusing children broke. And today we have with us a really special guest coming to us from South Carolina, from Hilton Head Island. His name is Dr. Jonathan Levy. He's an attorney who's licensed to practice both in California, here in Los Angeles, and also in the District of Columbia. And he is the lawyer who brought the first lawsuits against the Vatican for crimes or for activity and stealing, lawsuits related to banking, insurance, and slave labor matters. The lawsuits that were brought against the Vatican involved the stealing of money and property from victims during the Holocaust and the Second World War. So I want to welcome you to the show, Jonathan.
Yeah, hi, Allison. Good to be here.
Thanks for joining us. I just want to tell my audience that you also are a teacher, so we're going to be able to learn a lot today. You're on the faculty at Northwich University and Kaplan University, where you teach international law and public administration. And today, hopefully, you're going to teach us a little bit about international law, since you're a member of the criminal bar in The Hague, and you also have a PhD in political science. Let's start first with the famous case that you first sued the Vatican in Alperin versus Vatican Bank, which you argued from 1999 to 2009 before it was dismissed on the grounds that the Vatican Bank is immune from U.S. lawsuits because it's an organ of the Holy See and because there wasn't enough evidence that the gold that you were seeking was controlled by the Vatican Bank was still in the United States. So let me just break it down. I'm sorry, it's a little bit confusing, but could you give us an overview of that case and really what the history was and what wrongs you were seeking, what redress you were seeking in Alperin versus Vatican Bank?
Right. Back in the late 1990s, the U.S. State Department under Bill Clinton was looking into the Second World War era assets. They were looking at the German slave labor cases, Swiss bank case, and one of the lesser-known things that his Deputy Undersecretary of State looked into, Eisenstadt, was the Vatican Bank and something called the Ustasha Treasury, which was money that came from Yugoslavia after the Second World War, money that had been looted by a Nazi-affiliated government there and apparently deposited at the Vatican Bank. And I was asked by an Eastern European government to look into the matter and file a lawsuit, which we did, and that's how we started with Alperin versus Vatican Bank. And I have to tell you, I thought it was going to be a slam dunk the way those Holocaust cases were going, but it didn't work out that way.
Well, let me ask you, who were the plaintiffs in the case?
Yeah, the plaintiffs were survivors or their heirs from Yugoslavia during the Second World War. And so it was actual people whose relatives had either been executed or had escaped from there and lost property. But the interesting thing is, although some of the survivors were Jewish, the majority of people killed during the Second World War in Croatia because of religious belief were actually Serbs, Orthodox Christians. So it did not fit the paradigm of what we think of as a Holocaust-era lawsuit.
But there was a genocide against these people, these Serbians.
There was. That's right. Genocide against Serbs, Roma, and Jews in Croatia.
And did you have support? I know that a lot of the lawsuits involving art and Holocaust money were supported by the Jewish community. Was there support for this lawsuit?
No, there was not support for this lawsuit, and there were a couple of reasons for that. One, I also represented the government of Ukraine in the Second World War era slave labor and Swiss bank process, and frankly, there was a lot of animosity by the Jewish groups toward non-Jewish Holocaust survivors. They didn't. There was a big argument over money, and naturally, it translated over to the lawsuit against the Vatican. In fact, we took a lot of heat for that because it was not affiliated with, say, the World Jewish Congress or any of the people who generally control those things. So not only did we not get support, but we got a lot of pushback saying,
Oh, really?
What,
Okay. Was there?
This is the
Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, they told us it's the wrong way to do it.
They told you it was the wrong way to do it because they objected to the fact that it didn't focus on Jewish victims of the Holocaust?
I think they didn't want to take the Vatican on. I mean, let's face it. We've had all these things come out about Pope Pius and all the rest of it, but we've never seen any of the Jewish organizations actually go toe-to-toe with the Vatican. They just haven't done it, and they never will.
And basically your contention was, I mean, just to put it in some sort of context, that the Vatican took money and laundered it through, took this money that was stolen from the Serbs that were killed and laundered it through the Vatican bank, and you attempted to sue the bank to get that money back?
Right. We knew actually what accounts it went into. We actually had a good idea. It went into the Franciscan Orders account, an account for the what was called the Papal College of San Girolamo, the Diocese of Zagreb, and so on and so forth. And we wanted an accounting of those Vatican bank accounts. That's what we were looking for, is essentially an accounting. But of course, in order to get an accounting, you have to show some damages. So that's, part of it.
So where did the lawsuit fail specifically?
Right. We got off to a great start because the Vatican was not used to being sued. No one had actually had the nerve to sue those guys prior to that. If there had been lawsuits, they've been, more or less pro se kind of crank lawsuits. So how do you serve the Vatican legal process? As you know, they're not a member of the Hague Convention, so you can't go knock on the door of the Vatican bank. So we mailed them a registered letter, and we got back a note from the president of the Vatican bank saying, "Here, take your lawsuit back. We don't want it." So we went to the court and said, "It looks like they're served," and they had to hire an attorney and come into court and begin filing motions to dismiss. And because there wasn't a lot of law about this, it essentially took them 10 years to get out of there on grounds of sovereign immunity.
And okay, and what is the basis, even though the Vatican has diplomatic relations with most of the world, including the Palestinian state, which Israel, other people don't recognize, how do they claim to have, how can they have these international diplomatic relations and not have any kind of legal reciprocity where they could be sued?
Yeah, well, the Vatican's famous for that. As you know, they have these, triple redundancies. I mean, even trying to figure out which Vatican bank it was. I mean, there actually at times have been 3 different financial institutions operating within the Vatican. The one we sued is called the Institute for Religious Works, which is commonly known as the Vatican Bank, but there's, other financial institutions there too. So, how do they get away with it? Because they're the Vatican. And, to this day, people will go there and, essentially, kiss their boots, in the hopes that, they're not going to enrage Catholic voters. And that's what it's all about. So politics.
So it is politics. I mean, basically, what you're saying, and I think it's something that people are seeing with the sexual abuse cases, that they're politically protected in this country, and a powerful political force here, and that any lawsuit starting here has to get through that sort of political power base, even before you get to the Vatican?
Right. Yeah. You got to convince a federal judge. It's the and federal judges, as you know, they're pretty risk adverse. I mean, they're not looking for contentious cases like that. So they may play with you and toy with you for a while, like happened with us, but eventually they'll show you the door on something that's a real hot case like that. So it's difficult. And I don't think, in my personal opinion, that even though we recognize the Vatican because of the sort of things they do, launder money, cover up abuse cases, all sorts of crimes, I think that voids any immunity they should have. But the courts have pretty much backed the Vatican up on this matter of immunity.
Let's talk about what actually happened here, because you gave a speech it was something that we were looking at, to the Serbian Unity Congress in 2000, in October of 2000, and you said that this Ustashi movement during World War II stole immense wealth from its victims. And I guess, is that a group of people working with the Nazis against? I mean, who exactly was the Ustashi movement?
Right. The Ustasha movement was one of these Eastern European fascist organizations, like the Arrow Cross in Hungary or the Iron Guard in Romania, that were they were essentially fascist allies of the Germans. And as the Germans took over these countries like Yugoslavia, if they had affiliated organizations who were just as bad as the Nazis, they handed over the local governance to these sort of groups. So that's who the Ustasha were. They were recognized as the government of Croatia by the Axis.
And they made sure, that you said in your speech, that the war criminals, Pavelic and Artur Kovic and many others, made sure that the Serb property was seized right down to the gold teeth and wedding rings of concentration camp victims. And as the war was winding down, the Ustashi financial apparatus was gearing up. And they were positioned in Rome and Switzerland, and bank accounts were opened with the Swiss National Bank. So as Zagreb was liberated, you said, then the war criminals fled to Austria with an immense treasure of gold, silver, jewels, and currency worth tens of millions. And when they reached Italy, they got help from this Franciscan order that you were talking about in terms of safe houses, forged papers, and money. Now, where did you get the evidence of this? And I mean, how did you know about this laundering and cover-up and stealing, and the role that the Vatican played in it?
Right. Well, it's well documented, by the historians. However, we also have the benefit of the only witness, a fellow by the name of William Gowan, who investigated the Ustasha in 1946, 1947 in Rome as a special agent for Army counterintelligence. And Bill's still alive, lives in New York, and he debriefed these Ustasha who were hanging out in Rome, investigated, why they were there, why they weren't being arrested for war crimes, and he had the whole story on it. And we were ready to go to court. We did a 4-day deposition of this guy. So in addition to the documentary type stuff that the Yugoslav government had put together over the years, or people like John Loftus, who worked for the Office of Special Investigations of the Justice Department prosecuting war criminals, had put together in his books, we had the actual witness.
So why didn't the government take any action if this gentleman was working in counterintelligence?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, our government was kind of working at cross purposes. We had this guy Gowan, who he was actually 18, 19 years old at the time, and had gotten that position because he was fluent in Italian, and his father was also on the staff of the U.S. mission to the Vatican, the State Department. Although we didn't have full diplomatic relations, we had people stationed at the Vatican. So he was the ultimate insider. And while Army counterintelligence was trying to run around and corral war criminals, another arm of the U.S. government was working with the British MI6 to help them escape. And that arm was the arm of government that later became the CIA. A fellow by the name of Bill Angleton, who later went on to be head of CIA counterintelligence and lost his job during the Watergate years, was Gowan's nemesis. I mean, Gowan would go around, they'd lock up the Nazis, and the British and the CIA would let them out because it served their Cold War purposes.
But even if you're letting these war criminals escape, I mean, one wonders why the U.S. government didn't try to seize some of these ill-gotten gains. I mean, I know, they must have, since they were aware of the money. I mean, letting somebody go so that you can use them later is one thing, but getting money back that they could have used, I guess, towards the Marshall Plan, or even to, give to the families of the victims, if there were any families left. I mean, it's curious to me why they didn't I understand the politics of letting war criminals go, but I'm not sure I understand why they didn't try to seize assets at the time. Was it politically impossible, given that they had been sheltered in the Vatican?
Yeah, well, two reasons, of course. Once that money was deposited in the Vatican, and it was deposited there via a 10-truck convoy that drove up there and deposited it in 1946, is one problem. It created a diplomatic problem. But the other thing is the Vatican Bank over the years has been used as a financial staging area in the Cold War. So the money that was deposited in there was to be used to fund anti-Tito operations, anti-communist operations. And some of that money actually hung around until the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. So it was used for purely political purposes, but that's not the only time the Vatican Bank has been used as a conduit. I mean, money that funded Solidarity in Poland also traveled through the Vatican Bank. So it's a very political sort of bank.
Which would make it seem that it would be even more open to being served or being sued, since it's so engaged in international political operations. I mean, they have their fingers in a lot of different pies, except for when somebody turns around and says they're doing something illegal. Let me ask you, who represents the Vatican in these kinds of lawsuits?
Well, there's one guy. I mean, it's very strange, and he first appeared in our lawsuit because we were the first, but he went on to, cover the Vatican and all the sexual abuse lawsuits filed in the U.S. and is spelled by the name of Jeff Lena out of Berkeley, who really didn't have any litigation experience prior to the Vatican Bank case. He was an academic. Wasn't involved in a law firm, so he was an academic sole practitioner who spoke Italian.
Was he at Bolt Law School? Was he a teacher?
Yeah, right. Yeah, out of Berkeley. So he must have, all we can gather is he must have known someone pretty high up in the Vatican. But he's never been forthcoming about, what his relationship is with those people there.
It's interesting. I mean, first, it sounds a lot like Jeff Lena is like in the Godfather movie. He's only got one client. I mean, really? Is that when he shows up, I mean, isn't it necessary sometimes for the client to be present in any of these lawsuits? And I'm just curious, who is it that you deal with when you're trying to sue the Vatican? This is my first question, besides Jeff. And my second question is, how were you able to figure out where the money, which bank to sue, or what portion of the Vatican to gear your lawsuit towards? How did you do your investigation when you're dealing with the Vatican?
Right. Well, I'll take the second part first. A lot of the work had already been done. It was done by Deputy Secretary of State Eisenstadt in the Eisenstadt report, and then his work was based on John Loftus's work, who was a former prosecutor with was it OSI, Office of Special Investigations, that prosecuted, well, they really didn't prosecute that many war criminals, but that was their job. So it had all been laid out, so we knew it was the Vatican Bank. And then secondly, we never did find out who Lena reported to, and that's pretty much the pattern there. If you sue the Vatican, you're only going to deal with their attorneys, because their sole defense is the U.S. courts don't have jurisdiction over them. So, you'll never see their client, whoever that is.
So how is your case serving as a template for the sexual abuse cases where there are other U.S. citizens suing the Vatican? And I think, there are some cases where they actually have documents that went all the way to the Vatican. And we certainly heard that from Father Thomas Doyle, who has been a guest on the show. I mean, so I'm wondering, are they following your template, or is the template of the case here, since it was unsuccessful, something that should be avoided for future lawsuits?
Well, there's many ways to tackle the Vatican, And, I would just encourage people to keep going at it, just like they did with the tobacco lawsuits. And eventually you'll crack the Vatican defenses. But, it also, our courts have got to, grow some, balls here to actually take the Vatican on.
So, and when you think about, is it the federal courts that are, I guess it is the federal courts that you're dealing with the Vatican, but is there a part of the country where you think access it would be easier? I know here in California that the Los Angeles district attorney had been trying for years to get documents from just from the Archbishop in Los Angeles, and I'm curious, is there a state where a lawsuit you think might be more successful in terms of the courts over other states? I mean, one state that has shown more of a propensity to hold the Vatican accountable for their crimes?
Well, if I had to do it over again, we filed in San Francisco, which we thought was going to be a good place to go after the Vatican. I might have, maybe I would have filed in Brooklyn, in New York, get a Jewish judge or something on the case. Maybe that would have helped, but I kind of doubt it.
Well, given the fact that your victims, and that you're not being supported in this particular case, it was, because your victims weren't mostly Jewish, it seems like that probably, I don't know if that would have been too successful on that.
Yeah, right. And the Vatican's been sued in places like Mississippi on actually on a money laundering charge filed by, there were 5 state insurance commissioners that sued the Holy See regarding money that had been laundered out of insurance company accounts, and they were equally unsuccessful. So it's really tough to get the Vatican, and I think though eventually, somebody's going to end up getting them. My case, we're continuing over in Europe at the moment, so we're not giving up either.
Yeah, I see that. So what is it, how are you trying to go forward in Europe with this particular case? And is there international support for these lawsuits?
Well, I don't know about whether there's support or not. The whole key to nailing the Vatican is to try to catch them in some jurisdiction where they've let their guard down or somehow done something where, an international court or tribunal or local courts got some jurisdiction over them. And we did discover that the Vatican, they use the euro, right? They use, they're part of the Eurozone. They don't use their own currency. They mint euros. They like to sell them to the tourists. And in order to get into the Eurozone, they had to sign some anti-money laundering treaties with the European Union. And that's how we're trying to get at them now. We have a case pending with the European Union Ombudsman, trying to get the European Commission to move on that.
Do you have any statute of limitations problems with these kinds of lawsuits either?
No, that really hasn't been a problem because we don't really know if the money is still hanging around there or not. It's quite possible with these large amounts of funding that, residual amounts of the money is still there, and the money laundering can be ongoing. In the case of, for example, insurance company cases, you have cases that are going back to the 1880s still with insurance companies. Our cases going back to the Armenian genocide. So there is a precedent for these things that go back many, many years. It's unusual. Courts don't like old cases, but if you can make a legitimate argument that the money's still sitting there, the court should allow you to proceed.
So let me ask you this: given the fact that we are in the timing of this interview is interesting in the sense that we have the cardinals meeting in Rome to elect a new pope and the pope's resignation, and I'm wondering if you think that this scandal, maybe the scandal involving the laundering of money on behalf of the mafia, the sexual abuse scandal, if you think that your particular lawsuits and the scandal involving the Serbs has played any part in what's going on in Rome right now?
Well, we know something happened. Benedict, who is supposed to be the most traditional pope that ever was, suddenly breaks the mold and resigns. So, ill health, embarrassment, usually those things don't affect popes. So it's almost as if someone's got a gun to the guy's head. And so there are a lot of things going on. There's, the ongoing, abuse scandals. But I think it's internal politics. And of course, one of the things that always shakes the Vatican up is finances. Um, John Paul I was rumored to have been taken out because of the Vatican bank problems. There's, John Paul II had someone take a few shots at him and was almost successful. And there's, as you say, there's ongoing mafia stuff with Benedict in the Vatican bank. He had his secret documents taken out of his safe, so who knows what's going on there.
Yeah, I'm curious. Did you take a look into the book? I don't know if you read The Secret Papers of Pope Benedict the 16th, based on the WikiLeaks documents, and the journalist Newsy reported that the Vatican Bank, with some $8.3 billion in assets, had laundered approximately $280 million on behalf of the mafia. Is that something that you are using as part of your case as you try to get things up and running again in Europe?
Well, it certainly helps. I mean, we're not part of the mafia thing, but the way the Vatican Bank works is it really is it's set up to launder money. I mean, they've come into court and they testify. This is what we do. If you have money, a portion of which is going for pious works, we'll take your money. So, or your movables or your immovables. So, and then move them around for you. So, and take a cut. And it's generally about 10% from what we understand.
So, and the other thing that came to mind when I was looking at your case and your attempts to hold the Vatican responsible for laundering money is the fact that the U.S. and lawsuits coming from the U.S. were able to hold the Swiss banks responsible for keeping money from victims of the Holocaust. And I wonder, since there's a tie here, too, with the Swiss banks, with your case, if there's some way to get at the Vatican through lawsuits starting in Switzerland.
Well, obviously we looked at that, and
well, I figured, but I just wonder what happened.
Yeah, well, what happened was it was political. Those cases never proceeded past the very start. So the Clinton administration brought pressure on the Swiss government. So it was settled politically.
Okay, so that's the only sort of avenue left, is to go straight at the Vatican.
Right. I mean, the U.S. government needs to put its foot down to these guys and say, clean up your financial act and take care of the victims in these cases. But it's not going to happen. I mean, we've got a majority of Catholic judges on the Supreme Court, and the feeling is that if you insult the Vatican, Catholic voters aren't going to vote for you.
Yeah, and I don't know how true that is anymore at this point. I mean, I think that their political sort of stranglehold on American society has really been damaged by the sexual abuse cases, and that many Catholics are really openly questioning the Vatican because it's so clear that the higher-ups in Italy were involved in moving these priests around, these criminals, and covering up these criminal acts of sexual assault on children. So, I mean, what do you think? I mean, do you think that it's worth trying to get another go here in the States, given the changed political climate, or do you think it hasn't changed all that much, despite the fact that there are documents showing the complicity of the higher-ups in the church in hiding criminal priests?
Yeah, it's a question of when people's attitudes will change based on reality. So you take a look at these bishops and cardinals, you know what their orientation is. So, it's obvious to me. You see a guy like Cardinal Dolan as some kind of mealy-mouthed hypocrite, and they're trying to sugarcoat him, put him on there as a great guy. I wouldn't let him babysit, my kids.
I don't think I'd let any of them babysit my kids. Well, I mean, seriously, it's not that everybody is a sexual abuser. It's just the fact that so many of them seem to have been complicit in covering up the criminal acts, and they don't seem to even recognize how terribly destructive a crime this is. And we've discussed that here on the show. I mean, that sexually abusing children and certainly taking money from victims of the Holocaust, really not something you'd expect a religious organization to be involved in to this day, and not to have made any kind of remuneration for what they did. But let me move on to a different case that you handled in Canada. I'm not sure if I can pronounce it right, if you'd help me out here, but it was a very controversial case involving the Duplessis orphans.
Right, the Duplessis orphans.
Right, and
named after the former Prime Minister of Quebec.
Could you talk a little bit about that case and give a little bit of background for my audience, because it certainly was a controversial move for you to take it on.
Yeah, that case was one that I didn't even know about it, but it was a huge case of institutional abuse in the province of Quebec in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, where the Catholic Church in the province of Quebec were taking money from the federal government there to house tens of thousands of orphans. However, as it turned out, these weren't really orphans. They were kids that, families, poor people had been coerced to placing in these institutions. And then of course, the usual abuses occurred in the Catholic-run institutions. Some things like even worse, medical experimentation, babies being sold, a whole gamut of really horrible crimes. And the Canadian government has taken very little interest in the case. There was some very, very limited settlement about 10 years ago, and unfortunately, no Canadian attorney will touch it. So I'm handling the case as far as trying to hold the Vatican accountable. And we're not having a huge amount of success with that, but we're trying the best we can for the remaining victims.
Is the government protecting the Catholic Church in that case, the Canadian government?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what evidence do you have to support that conclusion?
Right. Well, in this case, there were actual murders committed of these orphans, and the Canadian government won't reopen the cold cases, go look at them. We filed complaints with Canadian Human Rights Commission. They say go file it with the Quebec Human Rights Commission. You file it with the Quebec Human Rights Commission. They say, oh, this occurred before we were set up. Go take it back to the Canadian Human Rights Commission. So they're just passing it around. They're not interested in reopening, a huge national embarrassment.
And what keeps you interested in sort of lost cause cases? I mean, what keeps you going here? And have you had some serious personal consequences from taking on cases that are so wildly unpopular or difficult?
Well, it's a great career move. I've gotten all sorts of interesting cases as a result of this. I mean, I've represented the former president of Taiwan, the former vice president of Yugoslavia, all sorts of cases I wouldn't have had access to previously. So from that point of view, it's a good career move. Also, when you're taking on organizations like the Vatican that are so well entrenched, I mean, it's not like a car accident that's going to be resolved in a year or two or three. You have to be willing to put in commitment for decades, or your entire professional career. And so, if you're going to take on these cases, you really need to take them on. Sure, I've had death threats made over the years, and just kind of shrug it off after a while.
Okay. Now my next question was going to be, what kind of Valium are you on? I mean, because you seem so sanguine and just sort of relaxed about the prospect. So is the attraction then an intellectual one where you've got to find the loophole to get through, or is it a moral victory that you're looking for?
Right. Well, actually, neither one. We're trying to do it for the victims, people who need some closure. I mean, this is the idea with any group that's been victimized. You need closure. You need closure for the victims, and I think even if they're no longer alive, you want their souls or ghosts, however you want to put it, to be put to rest.
Well, then that would be my question. Meant moral, that this would be the righting a moral wrong here. So it did sort of. I was asking, is that what the impetus? Because you're going to fix something, a wrong that was done to people, or is it just sort of an intellectual exercise? And it certainly requires a constant reassessing of your legal strategy to get through these constant blockades that are stopping you. I wanted to ask you, just to switch topics a bit, how has the media played a role in either helping you to pursue justice in these unpopular or difficult cases, certainly going against the Vatican? What has the role of the media been? Has it been helpful, or has it actually been hurtful in terms of its response to the lawsuits?
Yeah, the media is very tricky on these sort of cases. I mean, we'll get these sort of, 4 or 5 paragraph write-ups in national, international media from time to time, but no one's really done the in-depth story on this. And we've had people come out and film, people go through comb through the records from some really big name media outlets, and then somebody always steps on the story. It just doesn't get out there.
Away. I mean, certainly big outlets like Washington Post or New York Times, or I'm thinking when you refer to that, places that generally would do this kind of story. Why are they, besides, or were they giving you a couple of graphs and that's it, nothing in depth?
Yeah, that's it. And I've spoken to maybe over the last 10 years, 4 or 5 people with the New York Times. I've been spending long times talking to them, and the story just never gets done.
And do you think that that's a result of political pressure being put on the media? I mean, has anybody given you any reason about why the story's not going forward? I guess that's the question.
Well, I assume it's the editors at those, the editor steps on the story at some point.
It's really quite extraordinary that this is, I mean, it is such an incredibly interesting and intriguing story to think that there hasn't been a long form kind of piece written about it, and that you're getting answers of, I mean, well, what do they say to you when somebody comes out and films? They say it's been killed?
Yeah, they come out and film, and they'll go talk to my witnesses and do the full treatment, and then nothing happens. They say the editor wouldn't do it, the organization wouldn't run the story, and they say it's not credible. Oh, the Vatican couldn't launder all that money.
So do you think that they fear that there'll be some legal action by the Vatican if they were to write up the story and really delve into your allegations?
If they do, they're fools, because the Vatican will never sue anybody. I have absolutely no fear. I have more fear of being struck by lightning than being sued by the Vatican. The Vatican will never willingly go into a court and submit itself to a court's jurisdiction. I mean, I think their opinion is they're going to get me in the afterlife, right? So they don't need to worry about any of our stinking courts, right? So that's not going to happen. However, as you're well aware, at these media outlets, you got stupid corporate attorneys, and I don't know how their minds run, but you go submit something to an attorney for an opinion, and they'll come up with some excuse.
I could totally see. I mean, the reason I'm talking to you about this, it's part of the reason why we have our show, because I could totally see a corporate entity like any of these big organizations not running the story because it's going to create too much controversy and too many problems for them. And I think it's something that people need to be aware of, that just because they're not seeing something in their mainstream media doesn't mean it's not true or it's not happening. And for something of this magnitude, what you're trying to do with both of these cases, to not have gotten major media coverage is really disturbing, and that's why I'm asking you about it. I think people should be concerned that they're not learning about this, that they don't realize. I mean, the idea at this point of the Vatican laundering money is almost a truism to me, given the amount of information we've heard about what they did with overt criminals in hiding them. I mean, the fact that they would be using and everybody is quite aware, I would think, of what happened during Solidarity and how the Vatican was incredibly supportive, both in terms of, publicly, in terms of appearances by the Pope, John Paul II, but also financially in funding Solidarity through the Vatican. I mean, that was pretty well known. But I guess nobody seems to realize where that money's coming from, that you donate to your church and it went to fight communism. I mean, that seems to be almost is a truism to me, having grown up during that time.
Yeah, well, you would think people would know, and you have the Calvi case, from the 1980s. Calvi ends up hanging upside down under a bridge, so-called, Vatican banker. Sindona, the other Vatican, fixer there, ends up drinking a poisoned espresso. Godfather type stuff, but yet people, you go say, hey, the Vatican laundered a bunch of World War II loot, and they say, get out of here, you're making it up.
Well, to what extent were you allowed to conduct discovery in the Alperin case? I mean, were you allowed to subpoena any kind of documents, or you still just fought for jurisdiction the whole time to actually just get them into court?
Yeah, we actually did get some discovery. We got some out of the Franciscan order, And we were actually helped by Father Tom Doyle with that, because the Franciscan order was one of the co-defendants. So we know we know a lot about how they run. As to the Vatican Bank, they were forced to cough up some kind of self-serving declarations about what they do. So we do know exactly what their official version is of how they're run, which of course may not comport with how they actually are run. And then we also got a court order to do the 4-day deposition of William Gallen. And, it was half a day of me asking questions and 3.5 days of Vatican attorneys beating on an 80-year-old man trying to break him. And they were not able, to Bill Gallen's credit, they weren't able to break him at all. In fact, all they did was elicit a lot of damning evidence.
And the Vatican, you said that they use a gentleman that is out of Berkeley, but as counsel, as the lead counsel, do they also use other corporate attorneys, across the country? Is there a network of attorneys that generally you run into when you're filing against the Vatican?
Lena will be at the top of the pyramid, and if it's in a place where he's licensed, you'll likely be dealing with him directly, or a couple of the people who are associated with him directly. To the extent they have to use, a corporate type attorney, silk stocking firm, it'll still be Lena who's running the show.
The question, in terms of the response from the European Commission being, somewhat dismissive of your request for an investigation, why do you think that was? What was the motivation for them behaving as they did?
Well, they've explained it to me. I had a phone call with them a couple months ago, and they said, we're having trouble with the Vatican. The Vatican Bank is a very delicate matter with the Vatican. We understand your position, but we have to, until this is resolved, we have to take the somewhat strange position that the Vatican Bank is not in the Vatican, and therefore not under the jurisdiction of our treaties.
And you responded? How did you respond to that?
Bullshit. That's how I responded to it. Said, come on, Vatican Bank's not in the Vatican. But actually, I had documents signed by the Vatican Bank's Italian attorney saying, yeah, we're under the laws of the Holy See and the Vatican City State. They didn't have any comment on that, and that's when we went to the European Ombudsman and said, we accused the European Commission of maladministration. That's sitting there. I'm trying to get that moving. But again, there's kind of reluctance by the one section of the EU to try to hold their most powerful section, the European Commission, to the law.
Well, let me ask you, if people wanted to know more about these lawsuits, do you have a website that you could direct them to, or something, so that if they wanted to be supportive of your efforts to hold the Vatican accountable, where is there a place for them to go to sort of be in solidarity with your efforts?
Well, we have a site out there, VaticanBankClaims.com. However, you can just Google my name in the Vatican, and you'll get a ton of stuff too. So, just these days, just put the right words into Google, and you'll get your answers.
And let me just ask you the last question, because we're kind of out of time. What is the next step for you in this lawsuit? And have you also been approached to take on lawsuits against the Vatican regarding sexual abuse by priests and the people attempting to sue the Vatican for being complicit in hiding those various priests who committed sexual abuse against children?
Right. We're going to keep pressing the European Ombudsman to try to get some resolution on this case. If not, we'll probably take it to the European Union Court in Luxembourg. And I have another case pending over in London regarding a big cover-up by the UK cabinet of some documents that's pending with an information tribunal over there. So, and I have the Duplessis case, which is kind of, on hold. We're trying to pursue it directly with one of the Vatican councils.
Well, what documents were covered up? What are you seeking from the cabinet in London? Are they related to the Serbian stealing of money? What documents are they?
No, totally different. When Pope Benedict visited London back in 2010, an organization hired me to file a lawsuit against him. And we were the only ones to do it. We sued him over there in London, and the lawsuit got stepped on by the court. We snuck it in there, got it filed, and then they went, "My God, what's this?" And they threw it out of there real fast so that before we could get the Pope served. we smelled it smelled kind of funny to us, so we started making Freedom of Information Act requests, and finally the UK cabinet fessed up that they had a policy to try to counteract all legal challenges to the Pope while he was visiting England. But of course those documents are top secret and they don't want to turn them over.
That's so interesting. I would imagine that most countries, when he goes to visit, when the Pope goes to visit, probably had similar kinds of policies to make sure that he wouldn't get served or sued in any respect when he was visiting. That was probably part of the footwork that goes into a visit, especially these days before a Pope shows up in a country.
Well, maybe, but England's not an officially Catholic country, and why wouldn't the Pope? I mean, he's a lawsuit magnet with all the things going on. Let him get sued. I mean, he's going to get immunity out of the courts anyway. I guess they wanted to spare him the embarrassment.
Well, I want to thank you so much. I mean, I think, yeah, you would think that going to London would be the best place to where you would find people not in, particularly receptive to the Catholic Church in the land of Henry VIII. But what do you get? I thought it's an interesting try. But I want to thank you so much for coming on the show and explaining the lawsuit. I don't think it's particularly complicated, but I think it's something that the media should be covering, and I think it's something that came even before the sexual abuse lawsuits against the Vatican, and you're kind of paving the way to hold them responsible for what you allege, their illegal activities. So I think you're kind of fighting the good fight, and I appreciate all the work that you're doing, and I really appreciate you coming on the show, and hope you'll join us next time with some good news.
Okay, thank you, Allison.
Okay, thanks so much. And thank you to everybody for watching.